Hi, and welcome to today's Engaging for Missouri webinar. I'm Alice Roach from the University of Missouri, and I'll be your host today. With each of these 30-minute presentations, we intend to share research-based insights that leaders like you can apply in your own work to benefit and strengthen the state's agriculture and food system, hospitality sector, economy, communities, and families. Today, Dr. Sarah Lowe joins us to speak about the newly launched Rural and Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center. Before I invite her to begin, though, I want to share a few housekeeping notes. First, we'll close today with a Q&A session. Those of you who have connected today via your computers may submit your questions in the chat screen. If you joined today by phone, then you may email me your questions at roacham@missouri.edu. Second, all attendees are muted and may not start their video. Third, if you encounter any technical problems during today's presentation, then you can let me know by either submitting a comment in the chat screen, or you can send me an email to roacham@missouri.edu, and I'll do my best to help you troubleshoot. And last, we'll make a recording of today's presentation available. You can look for an email from Zoom that shares more about where you can access that recording sometime tomorrow. And we'll also include a link so you can download the presentation slides. And you can also find an archive of all of our previous Engaging for Missouri webinars on our Division of Applied Social Sciences YouTube channel. So now we'll transition to the topic of today's presentation, which is titled Introducing the Rural and Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center. Presenting today is Dr. Sarah Lowe, who's an Associate Professor of Regional Economics and the Director of the new Rural and Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center. So thanks, Sarah, for presenting today. If you could please unmute your microphone and start your video, then we can begin today's presentation.
Great, thank you, Alice. And thanks to everyone who has joined us today for the webinar. I'm going to talk about two things today during the webinar. First, I'm just going to provide an overview about the new center, and then I'm going to share results from our first issue brief that focuses on agriculture's contribution to the rural economy. I'll get started. So what is RaFF? Well, RaFF is a new center. It's comprised of a team of people who are really passionate about rural America, about farming families, and about economic modeling. We serve Congress primarily, and indirectly, we also serve rural America by providing forward-looking research-based insights that help decision makers support farm and rural economies throughout the US. We do this by helping them understand how scenarios may impact states and regions differently. We're in a bit of a pilot phase right now with the startup. We're supported by a 3-year cooperative agreement with USDA's Office of the Chief Economist. We'll have 4 state models as part of this initial cooperative agreement in this pilot phase. Now, many of you are familiar with FAPRI, and you may be thinking, this sounds a lot like FAPRI. Well, we are separate from FAPRI, but we're aligned with FAPRI. FAPRI has been working on the national stage in this area for almost 40 years. So FAPRI has a lot of great experience to share with RaFF, and RaFF is going to benefit from that. RaFF really kind of complements FAPRI's work, which produces nationwide 10-year forward-looking baselines. RaFF also complements FAPRI's partner, the Ag and Food Policy Center at Texas A&M, because they're doing similar work at the farm level. So RaFF kind of fits in neatly between FAPRI and AFPC and kind of looking at this regional focus. As Alice mentioned, I'm a regional economist. What do regional economists do, you ask? Well, you know, between the farm level and national level, there's a lot of regional variation. And here I just have a slide from some work I did a long time ago looking at ethanol plants and corn demand. But it's meant to just illustrate that this regional variation affects farms. It affects the natural resources, the weather, weather-related disasters, markets, you know, how close are you to the Mississippi? That affects farm income, okay? And so RaFF is going to fill this gap by analyzing agricultural markets and policy issues at the regional and state level, complementing the nationwide work that FAPRI is well known for and the farm level work that AFPC at Texas A&M is well known for also. We have three goals in RaFF. First, of course, and most importantly, are our forward-looking farm income projections. So we're developing structural economic models at the state and eventually at the regional levels. And those models, I think, will be very helpful to our collaborators in states. But we're going to use these models then to provide objective research-based insights to Congress, to USDA, to decision makers. Our third objective is public products, providing information to the public, okay? Not just Congress, not just USDA. And so our issue brief series is one way that we're going to explore some of these topics that are related to farm and rural finance and provide insights to the public that can help them with their own decision making. So those are our three goals, kind of the farm income projections, using those models we're developing to conduct objective policy analysis, and then communicating with the public so we can help rural America and farm families. A little bit more about these state farm income models that are currently being developed. As I mentioned, they're structural economic models, but what's really cool about these models is that we are combining local knowledge from cooperating states. So we have cooperators in the states that we're modeling. Those cooperators bring on the ground local expertise to help us customize and fine tune each state model so that it really represents what's going on the ground in that state. So this is, I think, a really neat sort of thing because we're really collaborating. We're trying to, gut check, does this model represent what's really going on in this state? And I'm really excited about state collaborators. If they're extension faculty, they're going to be out and about talking to farmers, talking to ranchers, and be able to help us fine tune these models so that they really represent what's going on in the states. Also, this coordinated effort allows for cross-regional comparisons. By having the models kind of centralized here at RaFF at University of Missouri, we can ensure that the models are coordinated so that they can stitch together really nicely. So that's a little bit more about our modeling approach. If you haven't already, I would really encourage you to check out our website, www.raff.missouri.edu. We've got a little bit of information about what's going on, but there'll be much more to come on the website. While you're on the website, I encourage you to sign up for our email distribution list. It's at the footer of the website. You can sign up there. And I promise we won't be sending you, gobs and gobs of emails, but we will send out our periodic issue briefs, and we will send out farm income estimates when those come out. So if you want to stay in touch with us, please sign up for the email list or engage with us on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook social media platforms. So that's kind of a high-level overview about the center and about what we're doing. We're really excited to have launched. We're really excited to be here at University of Missouri and learning and benefiting from everyone here at FAVRI. So kind of with that, I'm going to switch into kind of the analysis portion of this webinar, and I'm going to talk about our first issue brief. We're calling our issue briefs riffs, so a short ditty from RaFF. And the first riff is titled Agriculture's Contribution to the Rural Economy. But let me first tell you a little bit more about what to expect from the riffs. The riffs are going to be 2-pagers. We know decision makers are busy. We know that we need to communicate clearly. So these are going to be high quality 2-pagers with maps and figures, exploring topics related to farm income and rural finance. So each brief is also going to ask kind of forward-looking questions and encourage the reader to think about applying what they learn, having some kind of take-home message or action item from each brief. The briefs will also highlight when data differ by region. Again, I'm a regional economist and I love how things vary across space. So we're going to do as much mapping as we can in these riffs to help people understand how farm finance, how the rural economy varies across space. We welcome your suggestions for issue brief topics. Please email me or give me a call if you have topics or questions that you'd like to see addressed in future issue briefs. Chris Besson is working with us on these issue briefs, and he would love to chat with you about issue brief topics also. Now let me move on to the content for our first riff, but we're going to start first with a poll. A little interactivity for everybody. So the poll question, before we jump into the riff, which of these 4 sectors created the most economic activity in rural America during the year 2000? So please pick agriculture, manufacturing, government, and government includes K through 12 education, okay, or healthcare. Healthcare and social services are combined there. So which of those 4 created the most economic activity in rural America during 2020? So go ahead and launch the poll. I'm curious to see what you guys say. Okay, the poll results are in. Awesome. 41 of, and they disappeared. Maybe Alice, I don't have them. They're there, they're back. Thanks, Alice. All right, 41% of you answered agriculture, but close behind that, 24% of you said government, again, including K through 12 education. So that's a pretty big footprint. And 21% said healthcare. Only 14% said manufacturing. So awesome job on the poll, guys. Majority of you were correct. No, majority of you were not correct. Let me go to the answers. So 41% of you said agriculture is the most important sector to rural America's economy. And of those 4, actually, manufacturing is the most important. So 14% of you were correct. Woo! Do I have some kind of emoji for that? Okay, so manufacturing is around 16% of the rural or non-metropolitan economy in the US. Agriculture is at 6.8%, but that's growing. That's actually higher than it was at the beginning of our time series. So I've got the answers on this slide for those of you, I'm happy to take discussion Q&A when we get to that point in the webinar. So let me continue here. I think it's really important to understand how different sectors contribute to the rural economy because that affects investment decisions. It affects our strategies. It affects business decisions if you're a business owner. So I think it's really important to have an understanding of the rural economy and what's going on in the rural economy. So now I'm going to dive into the content that's in the brief. We have one chart and one map in the brief, and I'm going to give you guys a little bit of an overview on there. So this is a chart from the first brief that my colleague Chris Besson prepared. Essentially what we see here is agriculture accounting for 6.8% of the rural economy in 2020, which is the most recent data available. Now this is a 20-year high. This figure was 5% in 2001, 20 years ago. For the entire US, this figure is about 2%. We've actually had, in addition to the growth in agriculture, we've had a lot of growth in mining and extraction over the last 20 years. And so that's related to, of course, unconventional oil and gas production that has really, boomed during this time period. Manufacturing, FIRE, which is a jargony term for finance, insurance, and real estate, which includes renting and leasing. So any rented houses or anything housing is kind of in this sector. Manufacturing, FIRE, retail, and healthcare are pretty consistently important to the rural economy. Those are not changing much And government has actually declined quite a bit during this 2001 to 2020 period. And, those of us in Missouri know that, some schools are consolidating and getting smaller and going to 4 days. So a lot of that government decline is less government, it's less K through 12 schools in rural areas. So hopefully that was interesting to you. Now I want to look at the map, so kind of look at some of these regional differences. And I think these are important because rural economies are diverse. All right, so before I jump into the regional differences, I do have a technical note here. This explains probably, those of you who, put agriculture on the poll. So in GDP accounting, gross domestic product accounting, I know, very technical, jargony term, but let's think of GDP as kind of the rural economy. Think about it as value added or production from rural America. I'm counting agriculture GDP as agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting, but it does not include kind of upstream and downstream sectors. So food manufacturing, turning food into something you might buy on the shelf, processing meat, for example, is going to be counted under manufacturing because that's considered food manufacturing. So this is just production agriculture that I'm talking about. So let me show the map from the second RIF. And this kind of shows kind of the difference. The darker the green color, the higher the share of county GDP from agriculture. So you can see throughout the Great Plains, pretty high dependence on production agriculture. And that's partly because there are fewer people, there's less other activities, right? So there's fewer schools, there's fewer hospitals, there's fewer manufacturing plants where there's fewer people, but a lot of production agriculture. What's neat about this map is it kind of just shows how much the importance of production agriculture varies across the rural urban continuum. So we've got some counties in this map that over 70% of their GDP is from production agriculture. So keep in mind, the US average is around 2%. About 35% of the counties for which we have data had less than 1% of their GDP from agriculture. And the median, the most common, is a little over 2%, and the average is a little over, just under 7%. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a snapshot. We do have a lot of counties in this map that are gray. And unfortunately, the gray means we just don't have data available for that county. And it's not that the data aren't available, it's generally undisclosed to the public. And so in a lot of those gray counties, some of those gray counties just don't have a lot of agriculture, right? Like look at Alaska. But a lot of those gray counties, the data are withheld to protect the confidentiality of the business, okay? So we've got a few gray counties in Missouri. Some may be gray because they have very low levels of agriculture, but most are gray because there's one or two really big producers. And if we publish that information, someone could kind of back out what their GDP or what their value added is from that business. And so the federal government, of course, we want to be very careful not to disclose any confidential or private business information. So that's why we see some of the gray squares. So hopefully you guys enjoy this map. Be thinking of questions for me about this map and about regional GDP and how it can vary. And also, does this generate additional questions? Do you see something that you'd like to see covered in the RIF issue briefs that you've learned when looking at agriculture's contribution to the rural economy? So with that, we're about 20 after. I want to turn things over to our moderator, Alice Roach, and she will kind of moderate the Q&A. Please, if you have questions, enter them into the chat and we can have a little bit of discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And if you do have questions, please include them in the chat screen, or you can also send them to me via email at roacham@missouri.edu. Sarah, to kick off our discussion, I wanted to address how you highlighted that U.S. rural economies overall are diverse, but can you talk about on a more micro level what happens? So do rural economies in a particular area tend to specialize in one industry over another?
Yeah, great question, Alice. certainly we saw on that map, we see a lot of counties in the Great Plains that are, very dependent on agriculture. And that may be because agriculture is a big deal. There's a big player in agriculture in that county. Or it may be, like I said, that there's not a lot of other things going on. There's a really cool concept that regional economists use, and we call it regional employment portfolios. And it's actually borrowed from financial portfolios. So Alice, you and I might think about our 401k, and we might think about kind of balancing it based on our retirement goals, optimizing our portfolio. So regional economists also do that for rural economies. And so community leaders can actually think about optimizing their employment portfolio for different goals. So some communities may be very dependent on agriculture or very dependent on one big manufacturing plant. What economists have found, doing research is really that the most sustainable rural economies are diverse. Okay, they don't have all their eggs in the manufacturing basket or all their eggs in the agriculture basket. Because if you have all your eggs in the agriculture basket and there's a year with very low prices, or there's a flood, or your crop gets wiped out with a derecho, it can be really devastating to a rural economy. So yeah, you can actually use this employment portfolio optimization to say, like, well, how many self-employed people do we need? How much manufacturing do we need? How much healthcare do we need to have a sustainable rural economy? Because farmers need those services, right? We need schools, we need healthcare, so that farmers can stay in rural areas, so that farmers can be stewards of the land, of the water, of the air. But they've got to have those essentials, and so that's why kind of the diverse economy is a little bit more sustainable.
Yeah, great points there, Sarah. We have some attendee questions now. Do you mostly do your analysis at the county level, or are you able to do any sub-county analysis? And do you have a way to address any variation that occurs within counties?
Yeah, sure. So RaFF, our forward-looking farm income models are going to be at the state level. AFPC is doing kind of below the state level, kind of looking at the farm level. So we're going to do state level, and that's partly, based on the data that are available. So a lot of data goes into these state farm income models. As a regional economist, more broadly, if you're interested in GDP or other things in the economy below the county level, there's really very little data in the US available below the county level. It used to be we had a decennial census with a long form. So 1 in 5 people would get a long form on the decennial census. And that would give us really detailed information on education, race, occupation, different things. We got rid of the long form. And I think 2000 was the last long form. And so we now have the American Community Survey. So survey is very different than census. So for rural areas, you really can't get anything below the county level. And even some of the county level data from the American Community Survey, for example, you really have to watch the margins of error. Sorry to get technical, but because it's a survey, there's just so much variation. It's very difficult to get below the county level, particularly at rural areas. In urban areas, definitely you can get down to block group and have some good information, but in rural areas, it is really, really quite difficult.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. Another question here is, how will climate impacts be measured and included in your analysis?
Yeah, definitely. FAPRI and RaFF, we are grappling with how to think about climate impacts. And so right now I can say with confidence that, if a derecho does come through, we're going to be looking at how that will affect crops or livestock in that region. Flooding, similar sort of thing. We're going to partner with Office of the Chief Economist's GIS team, who after a disaster calculates very quickly what is the impact, how many acres are impacted by a derecho, or how many acres are impacted by a flood. And we'll be able to, through our collaboration with them, we'll be able to include that to run some scenarios with our models.
Yeah, great, thank you. Another question here is, how will you identify issues to cover in your briefs? I know you touched on that earlier, but could you expand a little bit? And will your briefs be specific to Missouri, or will they have a greater spatial scope?
Yeah, RaFF's scope is definitely nationwide. We are fortunate to be located here in Missouri, but we're trying to serve Congress, we're trying to serve USDA, so we'll have a national scope for the briefs. And we would love suggestions. What are questions that you're thinking about, particularly that involve spatial variation? We would love to get some feedback from you. We'd love to get feedback from other decision makers that are grappling with issues, particularly if we can help in terms of mapping or looking at differences across space and how they will affect farm income and ultimately the rural economy. So if you have suggestions, let me know. Our second brief is published. It is available on the web, and it looks at essentially the impact on ethanol that electric vehicles might have. So it's a very forward-looking brief, and we'll be doing a series kind of looking at some of these green energy sorts of things, so solar and wind. So we think that might be of interest. Let us know, even if you don't have a suggestion, you can let us know what you'd like to see more of or what you'd like to see less of.
Excellent, thank you. I want to hop back into some data that you shared earlier. You described that production agriculture generated about 6.8% of rural GDP in 2020, and that was up from 5% in 2001. So what are some reasons for the growth, and what are some factors that will shape how production agriculture's GDP contribution changes into the future?
Great question, Alice. Yeah, I mean, ultimately what drove the large, almost 20% growth between 2001 and 2020 is commodity prices. Okay, so when commodity prices are higher, agriculture GDP is going to be disproportionately higher. So on one hand, agriculture production is really, production and the value of production grows, then agriculture GDP will get higher. And on the other hand, in the larger economy, if other things in the rural economy shrink, that will make agriculture's contribution higher. So if rural manufacturing is shrinking, which it has been since I think the late 50s, that will make agriculture GDP look a little higher. If government employment in rural areas, i.e. those K through 12 schools primarily, if that continues to shrink, then agriculture GDP will look higher. So it can be higher both due to higher value agriculture, but also less other economic activity.
Great, thank you. I want to get into some farm bill discussion here because there are discussions on the Hill already about the 2023 Farm Bill. What do you think will be some of the rural economic priorities that Congress will entertain in the bill?
Yeah, definitely. In terms of the rural economic priorities, well, yesterday there was a hearing, the House Ag Committee had a hearing on rural development, and I tuned into that, and there's a lot of concern and discussion, of course, about broadband. And Alice, I did Engaging for Mo, I think in November on broadband. So I encourage people to look back for that if they're interested in learning about broadband. Broadband of great concern to congressmen and women, and housing also popped up. If we're going to grow the rural economy, if we're going to keep good workers on our farms, availability of quality housing is a big concern. And USDA is a big landlord in rural America. So those were a couple issues that I think are going to be really important, really hot in terms of rural development specifically.
Great, thank you. Well, it's time to close today's webinar. Thanks, Sarah, for presenting, and thanks to our audience for joining us. When you exit Zoom, you'll see a post-webinar survey will load in your browser. If you could please consider responding, we'll use the results to improve the webinar experience and also brainstorm future presentation topics. Again, tomorrow you should receive a recorded copy of today's presentation plus the presentation slides. And you're also invited to participate in our next Engaging for Missouri webinar, which will happen on April 6th. Agricultural economist Joe Horner will speak about renewable electricity in rural Missouri. Again, thanks for joining us and enjoy your Wednesday. Thanks so much again, Sarah.
Thanks, Alice.